Hi everyone, this video is about the African American war effort in the American Civil War. Before we go any further, it's worth noting that in every war since the American Revolution, African Americans, people of colour, have participated, even though laws passed in the 18th century were designed to stop that. We cannot deny historical fact. We'll get onto the denial of historical fact later on when we look at the lost cause theory. When war broke out in 1861, Lincoln was conflicted over whether African Americans should serve in the Union forces, and his main concern was how the border states would react. If you remember, when war broke out, Lincoln said that he hoped to have God on his side, but he must have Kentucky. He viewed the border states as crucial, and in his mind he could not allow them to secede. And by bringing black men into the Union Army, he felt like this might antagonise those slave states that had remained in the Union. But it's also worth noting that most Northern opinion was opposed to black men serving in the Union Army in 1861. Unexpectedly, abolitionists were anxious to serve. Black men could serve in the Navy, so why not the Union Army? And at the outbreak of war, we see roughly 10,000 men in the US Navy. About 17% of sailors are people of colour. By the end of war, 7 of those will have been awarded a Medal of Honour. And the leading voice for letting black men serve in the Union Army was Frederick Douglass. He said that it was no time to fight with your white hand and allow your black hand to remain tied. He also said, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter US, a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, there is no power on earth that can deny he has the right to citizenship." In fact, 2 of Frederick Douglass's sons fought for the Union in the conflict. But that wasn't from 1861, and that is because potential black recruits were denied positions in the army, thanks to a federal law that dated back to 1792, and that barred men of colour from bearing arms in the name of the US Army. That law didn't stop General Hunter, who raised a regiment of black volunteers from the Sea Islands off the coast of the state of South Carolina in 1862, known as General Orders No. 7. Unfortunately for Hunter, he was not supported by his superiors, received no War Department funding, and the regiment was forced to disband. But it was the first sign of the US Army, in this case General Hunter, believing that black men had a role to play in this fight. The mood did shift in 1862. Attitudes in the Union began to change. First of all, there was a growing number of enslaved black men in the South who'd been freed and taken as contraband on behalf of the Union Army, and the question of what to do with these men and how best to put them into service for the Union was being asked. Of course, a year into the conflict and the harsh realities of war setting in also meant that volunteering numbers had begun to decline, and there was a great need for more men in the army. And Congress acted. In 1862, it passes the Confiscation Act, which gives President Lincoln the power to use ex-slaves in the military. But he, at this point, is limiting the roles that black men can play. And at this point, in 1862, they're in non-combat roles, not on the front lines. What's interesting is that the Confiscation Act was passed just 5 days before Lincoln presented the Emancipation Proclamation to Cabinet. So on the one hand, he is concerned with enrolling black men into the US Army and the effect that might have on the border states. And at the same time, taking the biggest gamble of the first term of his presidency with regard to the border states, which is the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, we know that he deliberately left the border states out of it when it became active on the 1st of January 1863. But it was sure to make pro-slavers in those border states uncomfortable. Nevertheless, once the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect, the numbers of black soldiers in the Union Army simply exploded. And in a letter in 1864, Lincoln alluded to his decision to allow black men to serve. He said it was not a question of sentiment or taste, but one of physical force. Keep it up and you can save the Union. And that is consistent with his previous comments when he says, if I could win this war by freeing all of the slaves, I would. If I could do it by freeing none of the slaves, I would. And if I could do it by freeing some and not others, I would also do that. I think that the key point to make here is that Lincoln's primary focus is winning the war. Another important development in the year of 1862 comes in the month of August, when Secretary of War Edwin Stanton authorises the creation of a regiment of 5,000 black troops in Union-occupied Louisiana. Lincoln approved this measure, and the first black troops officially mustered into Union service in September. The first regiments came not just from Louisiana, but volunteers from South Carolina, Tennessee, and Massachusetts. We're going to talk about the Massachusetts volunteers in just a second. In May of 1863, the federal government set up the Bureau of Coloured Troops, and that was designed to manage the growing number of black men volunteering into the Union services. Unfortunately for those that signed up to fight, prejudice was never far away. Black units, first of all, were used less extensively in combat. They were also paid less. A Union soldier that was black was paid $10 a month, and $3 of that was deducted and given back to the federal government to pay for clothing. White soldiers, on the other hand, were paid $13 a month with no deduction. In June of 1864, the federal government does eventually reverse this. Congress grants equal pay retrospectively to any person of colour who has served in the Union Army. From June 63, we see black troops fighting up and down the battle map. First of all at Milliken's Bend in Louisiana, Port Hudson, Louisiana, 1864 Petersburg, Virginia, and most famously in July of 1863 during the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. During this battle, the 54th Regiment of the Massachusetts Volunteers, an all-black unit that you can see pictured there in the bottom right-hand corner, lost 2/3 of the men in positions of command and nearly half of their troops. And their fight is remembered quite famously in the film Glory. They were, however, commanded by a white man by the name of Robert Gould Shaw, who is pictured there. It's time to go through the numbers with you. Of the 46,000 eligible free black men of military age in the North, 33,000 signed up to fight. The bulk of black men serving in the Union Army were in fact ex-slaves. The nearest estimate we have is 100,000 men. We've also got 42,000 from the border states of Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland and Missouri. And that was the easiest way for somebody to earn their freedom if they lived in those states during the war. In total, 179,000 black men served in the army, roughly 10% of all troops. 19,000 served in the Navy. Nearly 40,000 died. 30,000 of them died of disease and infection rather than in the heat of battle. There were nearly 80 black commissioned officers. And I haven't really mentioned women to this point, so let's. Women weren't expected to fight in military roles. However, they were able to serve as nurses, spies, and scouts. And the most famous example is the heroic Harriet Tubman, who served as a scout for the South Carolina Volunteers. And if you've seen the film Harriet, it gives an incredible depiction of the work that she did during the conflict on the side of the Union. Now, serving in the Union forces for a black man was fraught with risk, not just the possibility of losing or risking your life for the cause, but capture could have quite severe consequences too. And unsurprisingly, black troops that had been captured by Confederate forces were more likely to be the victims of mistreatment or war crimes. In 1863, the Confederate Congress had threatened punishment to the officers of black troops and said that any black soldiers that were captured could and would be enslaved. Lincoln responded with a general order, and he threatened reprisals for Confederate prisoners of war in Union camps. The most infamous war crime took place in 1864 at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. Troops under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who you can see there on the screen, massacred black troops that they had captured. Bedford Forrest was a wealthy cotton plantation owner. He'd made money through the trading of slaves earlier in his life, and after the Civil War would go on to become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. So it's no surprise that he stood by and watched as his men massacred their prisoners. We need to take a moment now to talk about the Confederate recruitment or lack of enslaved African Americans. This picture has been incorrectly used to promote the lost cause theory. It's been used to suggest that enslaved blacks of the South signed up and fought for the Confederacy in defence of states' rights, not in defence of enslavement. It's just not true. This picture shows Silas Chandler, an enslaved American who was sent with his master, Sergeant Chandler. And the story goes that at Chickamauga Creek, his master was injured. He was to be amputated, but Silas refused that treatment, took him away from the battlefield to the safety of the family. And his story is far more accurate than the lost cause theory may suggest. Some enslaved men were forced to accompany masters as servants or as camp slaves from 1861. And pictures of those that have been pressed into servitude have been used to further that lost cause theory. Argument being that the motive for this fight was for states' rights, not for the institution of slavery. It just takes one question to challenge successfully that line of argument. When you ask the question, a state's right to do what? A defender of lost cause would then probably reply, make their own laws, to which you would then reply, their own laws regarding what? And then we get to the crux of it. The answer's slavery. You will be unsurprised to hear that most Southerners were opposed at the outbreak of war to allowing enslaved black Americans to serve. Governor Brown of Georgia, as you can see there on the left, with the slightly more impressive beard than Robert E. Lee on the right. Governor Brown said that bringing black slaves into military service would destroy our whole theory that they are unfit to be free. But by 1865, the Confederacy was desperate, and Lee, of all people, is the person that supports the idea of arming slaves. And in March of 1865, the Confederate Congress passes a law to arm 300,000 enslaved black Americans in the Confederacy. But it was too late. The war would essentially be over within weeks, if not months. Some companies were raised and pressing them into service had begun, but none saw action. Proponents of the lost cause theory would have you believe that up to 80,000 enslaved black men fought for the Confederacy in the war, but there isn't a single primary source, a single shred of evidence to confirm that.